Hey guys, tonight we're going to wander down the East African coast where ruined walls of coral stone catch the last rays of evening sunlight. The air is humid, heavy with the faint salt of the ocean, and even though the gulls circle lazily overhead, you're not here to fish or to trade. You're here to drift, to let your mind walk slowly among forgotten cities that once pulsed with life and voices. You step lightly on sandy ground, watching small crabs scuttle into cracks, and for a moment you imagine the bustle that once filled this quiet space. Of course, if you were actually dropped into the 12th century in these cities, you probably wouldn't last very long. Between the fierce sun's strange diets and a social hierarchy that doesn't really have a place for a confused 21st century time traveler, you'd be in trouble before the first monsoon wind arrived. But since this is all just a bedtime story, you can breathe deeply, lean back, and let the safe rhythm of the waves remind you that your only duty is to listen. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, I'd love to know your location and what time it is. As you're drifting off, share it down in the comments because it's always fascinating to see our little global campfire glowing. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The walls rise before you, a patchwork of coral limestone blocks carefully pried from reefs centuries ago. You reach out, brushing the surface with your fingertips. It's rough-pitted and surprisingly cool, even though the sun still burns faintly above the horizon. The builders stacked these coral blocks with remarkable skill, carving them so neatly that the lines remain clear even after salt rain and tropical storms. You imagine the calloused hands of masons who shaped this living stone, chiseling slowly while the tide whispered nearby. Mainstream historians agree that Swahili coast towns from Lamu to Kilwa flourished as early as the 9th century CE, thriving on ocean trade. The coral walls that survive today are the most visible echoes of that golden age. As you trail your hand along one wall, you notice how thick it is. Defensive, perhaps, but also practical. Thick coral walls kept interiors cool in blistering heat, a kind of natural air conditioning. Your bare feet crunch over scattered shells and fragments of broken pottery. One shard catches your eye, glazed in faint blue, chipped, but still elegant. You think of how it might once have been part of a bowl holding rice fish or some gently spiced stew. That's the thing about ruins, each tiny fragment is both ordinary and miraculous. Some scholars have argued that the very choice of coral as a building material had symbolic value. Unlike wood or mud, coral was tough, enduring, and drawn directly from the ocean, the same ocean that tied these cities to India, Arabia, and even China. When a merchant or traveler saw coral walls glittering white under the equatorial sun, they knew they had arrived at a place of prosperity and permanence. But not everything about coral walls was glamorous. You picture yourself lugging heavy, wet chunks of coral at low tide, stacking them on reed mats to dry before construction. It's messy, it stinks of seaweed, and occasionally there's a little crab still crawling out of a block. One poor builder must have had a real surprise when his half-carved stone wiggled away. That's your first light joke for tonight. You can thank the crab for comic relief. As evening deepens, shadows stretch across the ruin. You notice how the walls seem to glow faintly, catching the moonlight even before the stars appear. The porous surface of coral reflects light in a soft, mottled way. It almost looks like lace, a delicate fabric rather than stone. You pause, leaning against a fragment of doorway that once framed someone's house. Through this portal, merchants once carried ivory tusks, bolts of silk, and maybe just once a bundle of contraband mangoes, because who doesn't sneak snacks past customs? There's your second joke, tucked in as naturally as a mango under the arm. A warm breeze shifts your hair, and you think about how these ruins have weathered centuries of wind and rain. Historians still argue whether some of these cities declined mainly because of Portuguese aggression in the 16th century, or whether it was environmental drought, soil exhaustion, shifting trade routes. Maybe it was all of the above. For now, though, the scholarly debate doesn't matter. You lean against the wall, half closing your eyes, and let the quiet of the ruins tell their own version of the story. Nearby, a gecko darts across the wall, its tiny feet clinging to coral crevices. You watch it pause, throat pulsing with a faint chirp. There's a comfort in this continuity. Geckos were here, then geckos are here now, and they'll probably still be here long after the rest of us. A third little joke drifts into your mind. You could say the gecko is the real landlord of the Swahili Coast, charging rent in mosquitoes. The sky above you melts into deep indigo. One by one, stars emerge, and the wall before you seems to tilt, as if guiding your gaze toward the horizon. You imagine a sailor stepping ashore after months at sea, seeing these same glowing walls and feeling both relief and anticipation. The city promised safety, commerce, and the possibility of stories to share. You feel that same pull now, a gentle whisper from stone to ear, come inside. There's more to see. So you walk slowly into the half-collapsed courtyard, the coral walls around you rising higher, enclosing you in their quiet memory. With each step, the hum of the waves softens, and the ruins begin to breathe their long-forgotten tales directly into your mind. The monsoon winds are already stirring above the ocean, invisible currents that once governed the heartbeat of these coastal cities. You stand on a sandy bluff gazing out across the Indian Ocean. The horizon seems endless, a mirror of deep blue turning slowly to black as twilight gathers. A faint salt spray touches your lips, and you can almost taste the journeys waiting beyond the waves. In the medieval Swahili world, you would quickly learn that the winds were not just background weather, they were the clocks, the calendars, the lifelines. From November to March, the northeast monsoon blew steadily toward Africa, carrying ships from Gujarat, Yemen, and Oman. From April to September, the southwest monsoon reversed the flow, guiding loaded dhows back toward Asia. If you missed the right season, you could be stuck in port for months, which sounds like a nightmare for a 21st century traveler in a hurry. But for you here and now, it means everything moves at a slower rhythm. You take a step closer to the shoreline. The air grows heavier, fragrant with damp seaweed and faint smoke drifting from evening cooking fires inland. You imagine standing alongside a Swahili navigator centuries ago, watching him scan the stars and feel the direction of the breeze on his skin. Mainstream historians tell us that these navigators mastered both the seasonal winds and the night sky, guiding dhows across thousands of miles without modern instruments. It's humbling to think that a man with no GPS, no Google Maps, and probably not even a functioning pair of sandals could still get you across the ocean with eerie precision. A fragment of a song drifts on the breeze. Somewhere down the beach, fishermen are pulling in their boats, the wooden hulls creaking against the surf. The men chant rhythmically, heaving nets, while children run barefoot nearby, laughing as they dodge waves. You realize this is the same pattern that must have played out centuries ago when traders and sailors arrived on these shores with their goods and their stories. One quirky tidbit that always amuses you: some sailors used giant stitched-together sails made of palm leaves when cloth was scarce. Imagine that, hoisting what looks suspiciously like your grandmother's woven placemat to cross an entire ocean. It worked, though. Those patched sails caught the monsoon winds just fine, even if they made the ships look like they were decorated by a particularly ambitious picnic. You shift your gaze back to the water. The monsoon winds are steady, but not everyone agrees on just how early they began to be harnessed. Historians still argue whether organized Indian Ocean trade routes were already well developed by the late first millennium CE, or if they only exploded in scale later, after about the 11th century. Either way, by the time coral walls rose along the Swahili coast, the winds were already as dependable as taxes. The sand is cool under your feet now. You crouch, pick up a handful, and let the grains slip slowly through your fingers. You think about a trader from Persia waiting here for months, restless to return home. He passes his time by sketching patterns in the sand, maybe even writing letters that never made it across the waves. Beside him, a Swahili merchant born of African roots, but fluent in Arabic, chats casually about ivory prices and weather forecasts. The wind whips around both of them, tugging their clothes, reminding them that their fate rests in its invisible hands. The longer you stand on the shoreline, the more the breeze seems to hum like a lullaby. It tugs your sleeves gently, brushes your hair, and makes the palm fronds overhead sigh in long, slow arcs. You think of the sailors on their dhows, rocking with the same rhythm you feel now. Sleep and sea travel aren't so different, they both require surrender. Once you're carried off, there's not much you can do but drift. Your eyes close for a moment. You picture yourself boarding a dhow, stepping onto creaking planks darkened by salt. The deck is cluttered with sacks of grain baskets of coconuts, maybe a goat or two tethered at the stern. The sail billows above you, catching the wind like a great lung inhaling. And then with a gentle push, you're moving. The coastline slides slowly away, coral walls fading into the haze while the steady wind fills your ears with its soft roar. The goat bleats loudly. You glance back and one sailor chuckles, that one's coming all the way to India. Suddenly, you're grateful this is only an imagined voyage. You won't have to share sleeping space with livestock tonight. There's your first joke, a goat as your accidental bunkmate. As the dhow sways, you smell tar and rope coconut oil rubbed into the wood to protect it from the sea. Above you, gulls wheel, lazy but persistent, always watching for scraps. You shift your weight, leaning against a pile of baskets, and let the gentle rhythm of the hull lull you. The sea is calm, the wind firm. For a brief moment, you feel you could stay like this forever, neither arriving nor departing, just rocking between worlds. You open your eyes again and find yourself back on shore. The wind still moves, but softer now, like someone slowly lowering the volume on a lullaby. The horizon has turned dark. Only a thin line of silver moonlight ripples across the waves. The city behind you waits, coral walls gleaming faintly in the moon's glow, but for now the wind is enough. You breathe deeply, matching the rhythm of the waves, the rise and fall of centuries compressed into this endless cycle of air and tide. Your last thought before moving inland is a simple one. The people who lived here trusted the winds even when they didn't fully understand them. Maybe that's not so different from you tonight, trusting your own breath, letting it carry you deeper into calm. The monsoon-like sleep always comes whether you're ready or not. You leave the shoreline behind, following a narrow, sandy path that leads toward the heart of the city. The air grows warmer, thicker, and suddenly you're wrapped in a cloud of scent cloves, cinnamon dried fish, and something a little tangy that you can't quite name. Welcome to the markets, the pulsing veins of these Swahili towns. By day, these spaces were bustling, crowded, alive with bargaining voices. Tonight you drift in quietly, half imagining, half listening, as the echoes of centuries of trade wash over you. The coral walls give way to open courtyards filled with wooden stalls. You pass woven mats piled with coconuts, sesame seeds glistening in shallow bowls, and little heaps of dried limes blackened with age but still sharp with flavor. Someone nearby calls out the price of fresh mangoes while a boy tugs at your sleeve, insisting his family's honey is better than anyone else's. You don't have any medieval coins, so you just smile awkwardly and shuffle along. Mainstream historians agree that Swahili markets connected Africa to the entire Indian Ocean network, ivory from inland Africa, gold from Zimbabwe, slaves bound for Arabia, and in return, Chinese porcelain, Persian glassware, and Indian cotton. You trace your finger along the rim of a blue and white bowl sitting on a merchant's mat. It looks fragile, delicate, like something you'd rather display on a high shelf than actually eat out of. And yet here it is, laid casually among baskets of peanuts and gourds, just another item in a long list of traded goods. A quirky little detail: you stumble across some Swahili markets also sold perfumes made from ground ambergris, yes, that odd, waxy substance produced in the bellies of sperm whales. Imagine trying to explain to a modern shopper that their lovely floral scent comes courtesy of whale digestive issues. It's the sort of fact that makes you laugh softly until you realize someone probably paid a small fortune for that whale byproduct. The air is noisy but not harsh. The bargaining is musical chants of prices, counteroffers rising and falling like waves. You pause near a spice stall. The vendor waves his hand over bowls of turmeric, pepper, saffron, and cloves, the colors rich under the lantern light. He pinches a clove between his fingers and presses it toward you. You lean in, and the sharp, sweet scent makes your nose tingle. These cloves likely traveled from Zanzibar's fertile soil just offshore, still famous centuries later for producing the best spice in the world. Nearby, a woman is selling strings of beads. They catch your attention because they're not just pretty, they carry history. Archaeologists have found that many beads along the Swahili coast came from India, but some were made locally from shells and bone. You imagine children playing with them, then losing them in the sand, only for archaeologists to dig them up hundreds of years later, squinting and muttering about cultural diffusion. There's your first joke of the section: beads, as timeless toys that double as priceless artifacts. You wander deeper. The market grows denser. Lanterns sway in the evening breeze, casting wobbly shadows across the coral stone walls. A young man calls out about ivory tusks, long gleaming, almost frightening in their size. Another merchant shows off bolts of cotton dyed in indigo, the fabric soft and smelling faintly of smoke from its dyeing process. You overhear a conversation in Swahili sprinkled with Arabic terms. The language flows easily musical, a mix born of centuries of trade. Scholars still argue whether Swahili culture was primarily African with foreign influences layered on top, or a more blended cosmopolitan creation from the start. You stand there trying to follow the words, realizing that the very argument is a sign of how rich and layered this society was. A child bumps into you carrying a bundle of sugarcane taller than he is. He grins, waves, and vanishes into the crowd before you can react. You smile to yourself. This is what a living city feels like, ordinary, chaotic, full of tiny moments that don't make it into history books but matter all the same. Someone begins playing a drum at the edge of the square. The rhythm is slow, steady, pulling the market together like a heartbeat. For a moment, bargaining pauses and a small circle forms around the drummer. You lean against a coral pillar, closing your eyes, and let the beat thrum through your chest. The spice scents the chatter, the clinking of glass, and beads. It all swirls into something hypnotic. Then a donkey brays loudly from the corner, snapping you out of your reverie. You glance over and see the animal tugging at a sack of dates, ignoring its owner's shouts. You can't help but chuckle. Of course, even in a city trading gold and ivory, someone's always stuck cleaning up after a stubborn donkey. There's joke number 2, courtesy of the donkey union. You slip into a side lane, quieter now, but still lined with stalls. A merchant leans on a crate, offering you dried fish wrapped neatly in palm fronds. Another waves a clay jug of coconut wine under your nose, insisting it's the best you'll ever taste. You politely decline, imagining how well medieval coconut wine would or wouldn't sit in your stomach. Joke number 3 writes itself, bedtime history, plus coconut wine probably equals the worst hangover of your life. As you wander, you realize something subtle but important. These markets weren't just about goods. They were about people meeting, exchanging stories, forging connections. A sailor might tell tales of storms off Arabia. A local farmer might complain about mango thieves. A scholar might argue about poetry in the corner of a spice shop. Commerce and community were inseparable. By the time you drift toward the far edge of the market, the lamps are burning low. The crowd thins, but the scents linger, clove and fish and honey clinging to your clothes. You glance back one last time. The coral walls stand steady around the market square, glowing faintly in the moonlight, holding the memories of centuries of trade. You breathe deeply, letting those memories swirl into your own as you step slowly onward. You follow a winding path away from the spice-laden market and into a quieter quarter of the city. Here the air changes. The bustling chatter fades into the soft creak of wooden doors, the shuffle of sandals on packed earth, and the faint sweet smell of jasmine climbing along coral walls. You are entering the residential heart of the Swahili town, where coral stone mansions stand side by side with simpler dwellings, all whispering stories through their porous walls. The houses here are unlike anything you've seen before. Tall, narrow, sometimes 3 or 4 rooms stacked one atop the other, they rise like miniature fortresses. The coral stone has been smoothed and whitewashed, giving them a pale glow under the moonlight. Carved wooden doors catch your attention immediately, massive slabs of teak or mangrove studded with brass knobs and etched with swirling patterns. You run your hand along the grooves, the surface cool beneath your fingertips. These doors weren't just entrances, they were symbols of status, bragging rights etched in timber. Historians agree that these coral stone houses reflected wealth and cosmopolitan taste, blending African, Arab, and Persian elements. To live in one was to announce to the neighborhood, I've made it. I can host travelers. My children will sleep under solid roofs. You imagine a wealthy merchant ushering you inside, his silk robe trailing slightly in the dust, his smile wide but calculated. Step through the doorway with me now. Inside, the air cools instantly, the thick walls working like natural insulation. The floors are packed lime smooth underfoot, and niches carved into the walls hold ceramic jars, oil lamps, and the occasional seashell repurposed as decoration. You notice the faint echo of your footsteps, like you're walking inside a seashell itself. In the central courtyard, an oil lamp flickers its light, dancing across plastered walls. Women sit cross-legged, sorting grain while a child hums to herself, scribbling letters in the dust with a stick. Above the open sky reveals a rectangle of stars framed by coral stone. Courtyards like this were the heart of the home, safe, shaded, and perfect for both gossip and naps. One quirky tidbit: some of these houses had indoor latrines with carefully built stone drains leading outside. In a world where most people squatted behind bushes, that was luxury. Imagine being able to tell your neighbor, "Oh yes, we have plumbing," and then smugly pouring another ladle of coconut water. That's your first little joke, courtesy of medieval bathroom bragging rights. You pause to watch as a servant brings a tray of food: steamed millet, grilled fish, and a spicy sauce that tickles your nose even from across the courtyard. The aroma makes your stomach growl softly. It's the same combination people here ate daily, a cuisine simple yet full of flavor. A cat whines between the servant's legs, clearly hoping for scraps. You chuckle softly. Cats never change no matter the century. From a nearby room you hear the murmur of voices. Men discuss trade routes, weighing the profits of ivory against the risks of monsoon storms. Their tone is serious, punctuated occasionally by laughter at some inside joke. You lean closer to the doorway, only to bump your forehead gently against the coral frame. Smooth move, literally. Joke number 2, delivered by your clumsy skull. There's another voice, too softer, lilting, reciting poetry. The Swahili elite prized verse, blending Arabic meter with local rhythm. You catch a line about the sea as both lover and enemy, about coral walls as cages that both protect and imprison. It's haunting, lovely, and slightly ironic, considering you just smacked your forehead against one of those very walls. Historians still argue whether these stone houses were purely an expression of Islamic influence, or whether they were a natural evolution of earlier African architectural traditions. The debate echoes faintly in your mind as you wander deeper, running your fingers across coral surfaces, feeling how alive they still seem. You pass a stairway, steep, narrow, twisting upward. You climb the stone, cool beneath your palms, until you reach a flat roof. From here, the city stretches before you, lantern lights glowing like constellations, the ocean glimmering faintly beyond the faint hum of a market still winding down. The breeze lifts your hair, cool and salty. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crows early, apparently confused about time zones. That's your third joke. Medieval alarm clocks never did keep good time. You sit cross-legged on the rooftop, gazing at the interplay of light and shadow. Below, women finish their chores, children doze, men argue gently about taxes. Above, the stars shimmer in vast silence, and all around you the coral stone houses stand steady, watching over the lives within. The more you sit there, the more you feel the houses themselves are alive. They creak softly as the breeze shifts, they sigh as if exhaling centuries of stories. These walls have heard births, weddings, quarrels, lullabies, and whispered secrets under the cover of night. They've soaked it all in, storing it like salt in coral pores. You lie back on the roof, resting your head against the cool surface. Your gaze drifts upward, following the Milky Way, the same stars that guided sailors you met earlier. And here in this moment you realize the city is not just coral walls nor just bustling markets. It is these homes humming quietly with ordinary lives. And it is in the ordinary that history breathes most deeply. You rise slowly from the rooftop, brushing coral dust from your clothes, and follow a narrow lane that curves toward the sea. The night air is heavy with salt, and a distant hum of waves grows louder with each step. Soon you find yourself in a quiet, open space where the silhouette of a mosque rises gently against the sky. The structure is modest, low-slung, with walls of pale coral and a roofline softened by time. There is no towering minaret to pierce the clouds, no marble grandeur, only a simple call to devotion shaped by stone, sand, and sea. You step closer. The doorway is arched, worn smooth by countless hands sliding along it. You pause, feeling the cool stone beneath your fingertips, as though hundreds of voices have whispered their prayers here before you. The faintest trace of incense lingers in the air. Tonight, no call to prayer rings out, only the sound of wind rustling through palm fronds. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it, a muezzin's voice rising above the surf, calling sailors, merchants, and townsfolk to gather in quiet reverence. Historians tell us that Islam spread along the Swahili coast through merchants and sailors beginning as early as the 9th century. By the time these coral mosques rose, faith was woven seamlessly into the rhythm of trade. To pause and pray was as natural as haggling over cloves or loading a dhow. It was part of the daily tide, ebbing and flowing 5 times a day. You slip inside. The mosque's interior is dim lit only by a lantern perched in a niche. The air is cooler here, the coral walls thick and protective. A line of recessed arches runs along one side, each niche empty now, but once holding oil lamps that flickered gently during night prayers. The mihrab, a shallow alcove pointing toward Mecca, is simple but elegant, framed by carved plaster. You kneel beside it not to pray, but to feel the silence that still clings to the space. One quirky tidbit that makes you smile: some mosques along the coast had wells inside their courtyards, ensuring sailors could wash away salt and sand before prayers. Imagine trudging in from weeks at sea, smelling like fish and goat hair, and the first thing your host says is, "Welcome, please wash." It's practical, hygienic, and honestly a pretty solid hint for some of today's gym goers, too. There's your first joke: medieval mosques doubling as subtle hygiene reminders. As you sit quietly, you picture the variety of people who once gathered here. Wealthy merchants in embroidered robes kneel beside fishermen still streaked with salt water. A young boy carefully mimics his father's posture. A traveler from far away listens, not understanding the words, but moved by the cadence of the prayers. Here, the mosque is not just religious space, it is social glue, a place where the entire spectrum of life overlaps for a few breaths of unity. You trace a finger along the plaster wall. It flakes lightly, leaving a chalky dust on your skin. You smile faintly, thinking of the craftsmen who built this, who mixed lime and sand, who layered coral blocks until the walls rose steady. Historians still argue whether many of these mosques were primarily funded by wealthy individuals or by collective neighborhood effort. Either way, the result was the same: a sanctuary, plain but enduring, woven into the heart of every city. A sound startles you, a flutter of wings. You glance upward and spot a small colony of bats dangling from the rafters. One stirs, shifting its wings, rustling like parchment. You grin quietly. Even the bats seem reverent in here, their tiny squeaks like accidental hymns. Joke number 2, the original choir of the night slightly squeakier than intended. You step back outside. The night has deepened, stars bright above the ocean. The mosque's silhouette glows faintly in moonlight, its coral surface porous, textured like frozen foam. The sea murmurs nearby as if reciting its own prayer. You realize how closely the mosque and the ocean are bound. Sailors prayed here before voyages, asking for safety across the waters. Families prayed for their return. Every stone, every shadow carries that longing. You wander around the back where palms lean against the walls. The ground is uneven, dotted with gravestones, simple markers, some carved with Arabic script, some plain and weather-worn. You bend to read one, but the letters blur, softened by centuries. You exhale a long, slow breath, acknowledging the lives folded into this soil. The graves are not tragic here. They are quiet, steady, as though the dead are simply resting between voyages. And then a faint sound, a drum beat, distant but steady. You tilt your head. Perhaps it's just fishermen on the beach, or perhaps your ears are tricking you. Still, it feels as if the mosque itself is breathing, its heart synchronized with the rhythm of the city. You smile softly, thinking, if buildings could pray, this coral mosque would still be whispering every night. Finally, you lean against the outer wall, the coral rough against your shoulder, and let your eyes close. The sea sighs, the bats murmur overhead, and the memory of countless prayers hums through the stone. For a moment, you feel weightless, as if drifting on waves carried gently by the faith and hope of generations. And then a mosquito bites your ankle. You swat lazily, muttering under your breath, and chuckle at the thought that even in holy places, mosquitoes remain the most persistent congregation. That's joke number 3, buzzing right into your bedtime story. From the courtyard of the mosque, you drift back toward the winding alleys, guided now by the faint smell of spices that lingers in the cool night air. The scent is subtle at first, something like cloves, perhaps with a trace of cinnamon, but soon it thickens until you can almost taste it on your tongue. The Swahili Coast, after all, was not just a string of fishing villages. It was a hub where the sense of the world gathered, packed into wooden crates, carried across oceans, and spilled into markets that hummed with chatter. You turn a corner and arrive at such a market. The space opens like a shallow bowl, its stalls now dark and deserted, but the air still heavy with memory. You can almost see the bustle women balancing baskets of mangoes on their heads, men haggling over the price of peppercorn sailors, carrying sacks of rice from a docked dhow. The marketplace was the living lung of the city, expanding with each tide of goods and contracting into whispers at nightfall. You crouch by one of the stalls, running your hand along the wooden counter. A small pile of dried husks remains perhaps once part of a ginger shipment. Imagine being a trader from distant Gujarat, bringing turmeric wrapped in banana leaves, or an Omani merchant unpacking frankincense crystals that sparkle faintly in lamplight. Mainstream history notes that cloves became one of the most prized exports in this region, fueling fortunes and attracting powerful rivals. You picture the dried buds, tiny, harmless-looking spikes that somehow made empires lean in with hungry interest. Quirky tidbit: there are records of sailors tying clove buds into necklaces to keep their breath fresh. Forget modern chewing gum, imagine dangling a fragrant clove pendant and thinking, yes, this will impress everyone at the banquet. You smile at the thought because it's both endearing and oddly practical. First joke, clove breath mints, 13th century edition. The market was not just about food, though. It thrummed with textiles, beads, ivory, and even the occasional exotic pet. Historians still argue whether cheetahs were truly kept as a status symbol here, or if that's just a fanciful embellishment from later travelers' accounts. Either way, the rumor persists that a well-off merchant might one day parade through these streets with a cheetah on a leash, earning side-eye glances from neighbors who just wanted to buy some lentils in peace. You step deeper among the stalls. The shadows stretch long, and the coral walls around the marketplace reflect the moonlight faintly like pale lanterns. You imagine the sensory overload of the daytime market scales clattering as merchants weigh sesame seeds, the ring of hammers from smiths shaping brass, the sizzle of skewers roasting goat meat. Even now in the stillness, your ears almost hum with phantom noise. A young boy runs past in your mind's eye carrying a carved wooden box. He shouts something in Swahili to his friend vanishing around the corner. You wonder if the box holds dates from Arabia or perhaps sugar lumps from India. These little luxuries weren't just food, they were symbols, tokens of a world larger than this island, proof that the horizon could always bring something new. At one stall, you notice faint carvings in the counter, looping swirls, faded initials, a doodle of a dhow. You touch them gently, marveling at the human impulse to scribble boredom into permanence. Joke number 2, even in the 14th century, somebody got so tired of standing at work, they invented medieval graffiti art. You imagine being a merchant here at closing time. You sweep the day's dust from your stall, count your copper coins, and maybe slip a clove bud into your cheek for the walk home. The market falls silent around you, but the smell lingers, clinging to your robe, your hair, even your dreams. It's a perfume of labor and luck. And just then a thought: if the mosque was the spiritual heart of the city, then the market was its stomach. And like any good stomach, it sometimes growled. Historians debate whether food shortages here were common or rare, since the coast relied heavily on imported grain. Some argue droughts inland could cause ripples of hunger on the islands, while others believe the trade networks smoothed those risks most of the time. You tilt your head, picturing a city dependent on both the bounty of the sea and the goodwill of foreign sails. Suddenly, a cat darts across the square, chasing a rat in your imagination. You laugh quietly, thinking how eternal some scenes are. Wherever there's food, there will be rats. Wherever there are rats, there will be cats. The same drama unfolding forever in every market in the world. Joke number 3, courtesy of history's most persistent pest control unit. You wander back toward the edge of the market, the scents fading but still clinging faintly to your clothes. Cloves, ginger, frankincense, they mingle into a sleepy haze that settles in your chest. The night air cools, but the memory of spice keeps you warm like an ember tucked into your pocket. You know that when dawn comes, the market will roar to life again, filling the city with voices and smells, each trade a little stitch binding the Swahili Coast to the wider world. You linger one last moment, imagining the glow of sunrise striking the coral walls, catching the faces of merchants smiling in anticipation of another profitable day. Then, with a slow step, you drift away from the stalls, the invisible trail of spice still curling in your nose like a lullaby. Leaving behind the market's spice-soaked air, You follow a crooked alley that narrows until your shoulders nearly brush both walls. The stones underfoot are worn smooth, and in the shadows you hear the faint creak of rope against wood. You keep moving until the alley widens, suddenly spilling you onto the edge of the harbor. Before you is a forest of masts, their silhouettes swaying gently against the starry sky. The dhows are moored close together, wooden hulls bobbing like patient animals waiting for dawn. Their triangular lateen sails are furled for the night, folded neatly like sleeping wings. Even in darkness, the air smells of salt tar and a faint trace of drying fish. You breathe it in, feeling both calm and slightly queasy, like every traveler who's ever stood here debating whether the sea will be kind. The harbor was the true bloodstream of Swahili cities. Mainstream historians remind us that without the Indian Ocean trade, these coral towns might have remained quiet fishing villages. Instead, dhows ferried not only goods, but ideas, faiths, languages, and gossip, stitching Africa, Arabia, India, and even China together in one vast rolling conversation. You wander closer to the docks, pausing by a dhow whose prow curves gracefully upward, painted with fading blue swirls. The wood creaks under your hand as if alive. Imagine clambering aboard at sunrise, a crew of sunburnt sailors hauling rope while a captain barks instructions. And then the sails unfurl, catching the morning wind like a kite, and suddenly you're off, no engine roar, just the quiet strength of fabric and air. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Dhow sailors were known to navigate by the stars and by the color of the sea. That's right, if the water was greenish, it often meant you were near shore. If deep blue, you were far out. Picture a captain squinting into the waves, muttering, looks like we're the shade of laundry day indigo, so probably lost. First joke courtesy of seafaring fashion advice. You glance down and notice coils of rope piled neatly on the dock. The fibers scratch your fingers when you touch them, rough and honest. Someone tied these knots with care, because a sloppy knot could mean disaster at sea. Historians still argue whether the Swahili sailors borrowed more of their seamanship from Arabian traditions, or if they developed unique coastal styles. Either way, you can almost hear their debates. It's clearly our way. No, it's their way. Well, whoever's way keeps the boat floating will take it. The sea beyond the harbor glitters faintly under the moon waves, rippling in silver streaks. You imagine sailors lying on deck after a long day, pointing out constellations, telling stories of home. One man gestures toward the Southern Cross. Another swears he saw dolphins guiding the ship that morning. In such moments, the line between myth and navigation blurs until the ocean feels like a living guide. Closer to shore, fishermen mend their nets. Their hands move automatically, weaving strands with the patience of centuries. A child sits nearby playing with a crab scuttling across the dock. You smile, imagining the boy boasting to friends tomorrow that he trained a crab to march in formation. Joke number 2, the earliest attempts at crab drill sergeants doomed from the start. You crouch to look at a pile of goods awaiting shipment, sacks of ivory, bundles of mangrove poles, jars of coconut oil sealed with wax. Each crate whispers of another shore. To the east, spices and silks. To the west, gold and iron. To the north, glass beads and ceramics. The harbor is less a place than a hinge, a pivot on which the world turns. You remember the spice-scented markets and realize those stalls depended on these dhows, wind-driven lifelines stretching across the horizon. Without them, no clove bud necklace, no ginger stews, no whispered debates about cheetah pets. Everything flowed through the sails and ropes you now touch. Then a gull screeches overhead, startling you. It lands nearby, staring boldly as if demanding tribute. You toss it an imaginary scrap and it struts proudly head high. Joke number 3, medieval gulls were basically feathered dock inspectors charging tolls in fish bits. The harbor quiets again, the waves lapping gently. You imagine a lone dhow pushing off under moonlight, its sail catching a night breeze heading toward Arabia or India. The sound of its departure is almost like a lullaby, the swish of water against hull, the creak of timbers, the flap of canvas. You close your eyes, and for a moment you too are aboard, drifting gently into sleep with the stars as your compass. When you open your eyes again, the harbor is still, the dhows resting like patient beasts. The night deepens, and you turn slowly away, carrying the rhythm of the ocean in your bones. The harbor fades behind you, but the sea air clings to your clothes as you wander uphill along a sandy path. It grows quieter, the bustle of trade replaced by something more intimate, the sounds of homes. Here the coral walls rise not in grandeur but in comfort, enclosing courtyards that hide families from the street. The Swahili city is alive not just with merchants and sailors, but with mothers, children, grandparents, and cousins, all woven into one daily rhythm. You pause outside a doorway framed in carved wood, the panels etched with swirling floral motifs and geometric lines. The surface is smooth, where countless hands have pushed it open. Through the doorway drifts the faint smell of stewing lentils mixed with coconut milk. Your stomach rumbles softly. You smile, realizing that after all the trade routes and dows, life at its core still boils down to dinner simmering in a pot. Inside, you find a courtyard shaded by a mango tree. A mat is spread across the ground, and family members sit cross-legged, bowls in hand. Coconut rice steams fragrantly sprinkled with cloves that once traveled the same harbor you visited. A young girl carefully balances a clay jug, pouring tamarind juice for her father. He pats her shoulder with pride, the gesture so ordinary, yet so tender that it lingers in your chest. Mainstream historians note how Swahili cuisine was shaped by the constant flow of goods, rice from Asia, spices from the Indian Ocean, world fish, and coconuts from local shores. But here in this courtyard, the scholarly fact transforms into something deeply personal. A boy licks curry from his fingers. His mother fusses over whether he's had enough, and you find yourself grinning because the scene could belong to almost any time or place. Here's a quirky tidbit in some households. Food wasn't eaten from plates, but from one large shared platter, everyone dipping with the right hand. Imagine the chaos if someone absent-mindedly grabbed with the left hand. Scandal, it was considered unclean. You chuckle quietly, thinking of modern picky eaters and how they'd panic at the sight of so many fingers hovering near their curry. First joke of the section: dinner etiquette meets hand drama. As the family eats, the conversation flows easily. They talk about a neighbor's new dhow, a cousin's wedding, the price of ivory in the market. Their words weave together the public and private, showing how the rhythms of trade seep into the rhythms of the home. You lean back listening and realize that for all the grandeur of coral walls and overseas goods, the true treasure here is connection. Historians still argue whether Swahili domestic life leaned more toward African or Arab cultural models, or whether it was an inseparable blend. You picture anthropologists squinting at door frames, counting how many words in daily Swahili are Arabic versus Bantu, and you shake your head gently. To the family you're watching, such debates never mattered. Their home is neither one thing nor another. It is simply theirs, shaped by whatever kept them together and fed. A grandmother clears her throat and begins telling a story to the children. Her voice is low, rhythmic, as though she's pulling words straight from the soil. She speaks of a sea spirit who guides lost sailors, of a trickster monkey who once stole coconuts from a sultan's storehouse. The children giggle and cover their mouths wide-eyed with delight. You can't help but smile because bedtime stories apparently never go out of style. Joke number 2, whether it's a sea spirit or a sock-eating monster, every culture has its way of scaring kids into brushing their teeth. You glance up at the sky where the stars have multiplied. Somewhere nearby, another courtyard echoes with a different story. Another family eating mangoes, another child falling asleep with rice still on their cheek. The city's heartbeat is not only in its trade or mosques, but in these quiet courtyards multiplying endlessly like lanterns in the night. Suddenly, a goat bleats from the corner of the yard, startling everyone. The children squeal with laughter, and the grandmother scolds the animal half-heartedly. You grin, apparently even ancient goats loved dramatic entrances. Joke number 3, delivered courtesy of livestock with perfect comedic timing. As the meal winds down, bowls are stacked and the mat is rolled away. The family lingers in conversation, their voices blending into the night air. You step softly back toward the alley, leaving them to their rhythm. Behind you, the grandmother's story continues, weaving into the hum of crickets and the distant crash of waves. The coral walls rise around you again, steady and quiet. You realize you've glimpsed not just the public face of the Swahili Coast, but its heart, the laughter over shared rice, the whispered stories under mango leaves, the ordinary moments that outlast empires. You walk on the warmth of that courtyard, still glowing faintly in your chest. You leave the family courtyard behind and let your feet carry you deeper into the winding streets. The sounds of laughter and cooking fade, replaced by a more solemn rhythm. The path opens into a quiet space bordered by low coral walls and scattered stone markers. You've stumbled upon the city's cemetery where the night feels thicker, the air somehow heavier. The gravestones are simple, some no more than upright slabs of coral, others carved with delicate Arabic script. Moonlight slides across them, catching edges worn down by centuries of rain and salt wind. You crouch beside one marker, tracing the faded lines with your fingers. The names are hard to read now, but once they rang out in prayers called at dawn and dusk, remembered in whispers. Mainstream historians note that Swahili cemeteries were often located close to mosques, reinforcing the bond between daily prayer and eternal rest. To walk from a bustling marketplace to a graveyard was to feel the entire cycle of life compressed into one short journey. In a city where dows came and went carrying fortunes or misfortunes, these stones were the one certainty and anchor when everything else shifted with the tide. You notice a peculiar detail. Some of the tombs are topped with small coral pillars, like miniature towers. They look oddly cheerful, as though the dead were given a little architectural flourish for their journey. Quirky tidbit: in certain coastal towns, wealthier families commission tombs with elaborate coral carvings, turning burial grounds into open-air art galleries. You tilt your head, amused at the thought of neighbors quietly competing. Oh, so-and-so got spiral motifs on their tomb, we'll add a dome to ours. First joke, medieval homeowners association, but for the afterlife. You walk slowly between the graves, the sand crunching softly beneath your sandals. Some stones are tilted, half swallowed by the earth, while others stand straight and proud. Historians still argue whether the distinct styles of tomb markers show more influence from Persia, Arabia, or indigenous African traditions. Each theory insists on a different story, yet standing here you sense that perhaps the debate misses the point. The stones belong to the coast itself, carved from coral, and returned to coral, as local as the waves. The silence is not empty. Crickets chirp steadily, a night bird cries in the distance, and the faintest rustle of palm leaves punctuates the air. You sit on a low wall, letting your eyes wander over the rows of markers. It feels strangely soothing, proof that people lived, loved, prayed, and eventually rested here. The graveyard is not eerie. It's steady grounding, like a hand on your shoulder, reminding you to breathe slowly. For a moment you imagine attending a funeral centuries ago. The townsfolk gather quietly, men carrying the body wrapped in a simple shroud. Prayers rise soft and rhythmic, carried by the wind. The body is lowered into the earth, and hands scoop coral sand, covering it gently. The ceremony is plain, almost austere, but the weight of community is immense. Each person carries part of the grief, part of the memory. You shift slightly and realize a small gecko is staring at you from one of the stones. It blinks slowly, then flicks its tongue at a passing insect. You chuckle softly. Apparently, even in graveyards, someone's always looking for a snack. Joke number 2, courtesy of the cemetery's least solemn resident. You rise and wander toward a larger, more elaborate tomb. Its coral surface is intricately carved, though time has blurred the designs. You run your fingers across it, thinking of the mason who spent weeks chiseling every swirl. Did he hum to himself as he worked? Did he pause to swat mosquitoes, curse under his breath, and then return to his chisel? You grin at the thought history's artisans were human too, dealing with the same tiny annoyances we face today. The air cools as a breeze sweeps in from the sea. You inhale deeply, noticing how the salty tang mingles with the earthy scent of sand and stone. This place holds no menace. Instead, it hums with continuity, a reminder that in a city of ceaseless arrivals and departures, people found ways to stay. You glance one last time at the rows of stones. Some nearly vanish into the sand, others glow faintly in the moonlight. Together they form a kind of choral library, every marker a chapter in a story too vast to be read in one night. And just as you're about to turn away, a rooster crows somewhere in the distance, too early, too loud, breaking the spell with comic timing. You laugh softly to yourself. Joke number 3, even in the city of the dead, some chickens simply refuse to respect bedtime. You step back toward the winding street, the calm of the graveyard still resting in your chest like a slow heartbeat. You leave the quiet of the cemetery and wander uphill where the city seems to open like a book. The streets broaden, the walls rise higher, and you find yourself facing the remains of a palace. Its outline dominates the horizon, a coral fortress softened by centuries of sea air. Though much of it has crumbled, you can still sense the grandeur archways that once gleamed courtyards, that once echoed with footsteps and commands. You step inside through a half-collapsed doorway. The floor crunches beneath your sandals, a mixture of sand and fallen plaster. Ahead, a wide hall stretches lined with carved niches and faint traces of paint. The walls, though faded, still whisper of authority. This was where rulers sat known as Sultan's men, whose influence spread across the Indian Ocean trade. Mainstream history tells us that Kilwa, one of the Swahili Coast's great cities, was once ruled by a dynasty claiming descent from Persian princes. Whether entirely true or partly myth, such lineage bolstered their legitimacy. Imagine a sultan seated here robed in silk imported from China, while merchants from Arabia bowed low to negotiate ivory prices. Power like spice had a scent, and in this hall it smelled of cinnamon sandalwood and ambition. You wander into a side chamber. The ceiling arches gracefully overhead, fragments of coral still clinging in place. Quirky tidbits: some accounts suggest Swahili palaces had elaborate indoor plumbing channels carved into coral for water to flow through courtyards and bathing rooms. You picture a sultan luxuriating in a cool bath while servants fetched buckets from wells. Then you grin, the ancient world's equivalent of bragging about your deluxe bathroom remodel. First joke: palace plumbing as status symbol. You run your hand along the wall, noticing faint carvings, a repeating motif of waves and spirals. Historians still argue whether these designs carried symbolic meaning or were simply decorative. Were they prayers etched into stone invoking the sea's protection, or just the medieval version of fancy wallpaper? The truth, as usual, hides somewhere between intention and aesthetics. The palace hums with imagined echoes. You hear the clatter of sandals, the shuffle of servants carrying trays of fruit, the rustle of scribes unrolling documents. Somewhere a stern advisor whispers advice, while the sultan drums his fingers impatiently. The space is alive with the politics of the past, and you can almost feel the weight of decision-making pressing against the coral walls. You climb a narrow staircase, its steps uneven but intact. At the top, the city sprawls below rooftops glowing in moonlight. From this vantage point, you understand why rulers built here. The palace overlooks harbor, mosque, market, and cemetery. Every strand of life lies within sight, reminding the sultan of both wealth and responsibility. As you stand at the balcony, a cool breeze sweeps through your hair. You close your eyes and imagine an evening audience centuries ago. The sultan, seated on cushions, listens to envoys presenting gifts: a bolt of silk, a bag of pearls, perhaps even a giraffe calf, awkward and blinking. You chuckle quietly, imagining palace servants scrambling to find enough leaves for their new guest. Joke number 2. Nothing like bringing a giraffe to a palace meeting and pretending it's perfectly normal. You step back inside, entering what might once have been the treasury. The walls are thicker here, the space dimmer. You picture jars of coins, strings of beads, tusks stacked neatly against the wall. The wealth of nations gathered here, all funneled into coral vaults. Yet wealth is never permanent. A leak in the roof, a raid by rivals, or even just time itself could scatter riches like dust in the wind. Still, there is pride in the construction. The coral blocks are carefully aligned, the mortar smooth. Even as sections crumble, the craftsmanship endures. You touch the stone, rough and cool, and think of the masons who built it, not rulers or merchants, but ordinary hands chiseling day after day. Their names are lost, but their labor still stands, resisting centuries of storms. You pause by a wide doorway open to the night. The moonlight spills across the floor, outlining a mosaic of broken tiles. You crouch, tracing a piece with your finger, a fragment of blue glaze, perhaps imported from Persia. Someone centuries ago stepped across this same tile, perhaps barefoot, perhaps in jeweled sandals. The distance between you and them shrinks to a heartbeat. A rustle behind you startles your reverie. A stray cat slinks into the hall, tail high, eyes gleaming. It pauses, regards you with disdain, then proceeds to groom itself in the middle of the sultan's hall. You laugh softly. Apparently, even palaces were never safe from feline entitlement. Joke number 3. The eternal truth that cats assume every throne is theirs. You lean against the wall, gazing around the ruined palace. Its power has faded, its rulers forgotten, yet the coral stones endure, humming with stories. In their silence, they remind you of the fragile balance between wealth and weather, ambition and decay. You take a slow breath, letting that lesson settle into your bones like the night air. When you finally step back into the street, the palace looms behind you, its silhouette a reminder of glory tempered by time. You leave the shadow of the palace and let your path slope back toward the sea. The air feels warmer here, thick with the scent of brine and mangroves. The coral walls fall away, replaced by sandy stretches where the city meets the ocean's edge. It's quieter than the marketplace, calmer than the palace. The tide sighs against the shore, dragging lines of seaweed and shells into lazy patterns. Ahead, a series of wooden stakes rise from the shallow's fish trap, still visible after all these centuries. They form geometric patterns, fences, guiding fish into pockets where they could be scooped up with ease. You crouch on the damp sand, running your fingers across a shard of shell, and imagine the generations of fishermen who relied on these simple yet ingenious designs. Mainstream historians note how central fishing was to the Swahili diet, particularly tuna snapper and sardines. The ocean provided not only food, but also trade goods, dried fish packed into bundles, sea cucumbers prized in distant China. The ocean was larder highway and myth all at once. You listen to the waves and realize every tide carried both dinner and destiny. A quirky tidbit floats into your mind. There are reports of Swahili fishermen using songs to time their nets. The verses match the rhythm of pulling, casting, or hauling, ensuring everyone worked in sync. You smile, picturing a ragtag choir belting out tunes while dragging in sardines. Joke number 1. The earliest version of a workplace playlist, except it was live and everyone had to sing along, whether they wanted to or not. You wander further along the beach. The moonlight shines on scattered shells, each one a tiny cathedral of sound if you press it to your ear. Children once collected these shells, stringing them into necklaces or using them as play money. Somewhere, a little boy might have bought an imaginary palace with a handful of cowries, lording over his friends with a grin. You can't help but chuckle at the thought. Monopoly Swahili edition. Historians still argue about the full extent of maritime technology along this coast. Were the locals merely adopting techniques from incoming sailors, or were they innovators in their own right? The evidence is fragmentary, a carved rudder here, a broken anchor there. The debate drifts like the tide, unresolved but intriguing. You pause by a cluster of mangrove roots jutting from the water. The wood twists and tangles like a frozen ballet. A crab scuttles sideways, pausing to glare at you with tiny eyes. You grin, wondering if crabs consider humans the intruders. Joke number 2. Perhaps in their chronicles, the great menace of the coast wasn't Portugal or drought, but one clumsy biped stealing shells. Further out, the silhouette of a dhow drifts slowly across the horizon, its lateen sail a ghostly triangle against the stars. You imagine the crew aboard, half asleep, lulled by the rocking waves. Someone hums quietly, someone else snores, and the sea itself provides percussion. For them, the ocean isn't a boundary, but a road leading always onward. The shoreline here is dotted with fire pits, blackened stones arranged in circles. You kneel beside one, brushing away sand. Families once cooked their catch here, fish skewered on sticks, roasted and eaten hot. You close your eyes and let the phantom scent of grilled snapper drift past. It mingles with the salt air, comforting and grounding. You stand and wander a little farther where the surf foams around your ankles. The water is cool, refreshing after the dusty streets. You tilt your head back, letting the sea breeze wash across your face. The rhythm of the tide is hypnotic, a lullaby sung by the earth itself. Suddenly, something cold and slimy brushes your foot. You jolt slightly, then glance down to see a piece of drifting seaweed. Relief floods you, followed quickly by amusement. Joke number 3. Nothing like mistaking salad for sea monsters. The waves retreat, leaving ripples of foam behind. You watch as the water pulls tiny shells and pebbles into new designs, erasing old ones. The shore is always rewriting itself, just as history does, one tide covering another, yet always leaving faint traces behind. You linger for a while, letting the ocean's pulse slow your breathing. Here, away from the palace's grandeur and the marketplace's chatter, you feel the simplest truth of the Swahili coast, a life shaped by the sea, steady as the tide, patient as coral stone. You leave the shoreline behind and follow a narrow trail where the sand gives way to tangled roots and creeping vines. The path leads into the hushed embrace of abandoned lanes, once lively with footsteps now reclaimed by leaves and silence. The air cools beneath a canopy of baobab and tamarind, their roots prying through coral walls like determined explorers. You step softly as if disturbing a dream. This is Gedi, one of the most famous of the Swahili ghost towns. Its coral mosques, homes, and palace still stand in partial dignity, though monkeys scamper where merchants once haggled. You run your hand across the porous coral blocks, cool and rough, and wonder about the masons who placed them here stone by stone. Mainstream history records that Gedi thrived between the 13th and 17th centuries, a hub of culture and trade before its sudden decline. No one knows exactly why it was abandoned. A quirky tidbit lingers in local lore. Some say the ruins are protected by spirits, the Mazimu. Visitors who disrespected the site say trying to pocket a coral fragment were said to suffer sudden misfortune. You smirk and tuck your own empty hands conspicuously behind your back, as if to assure any watching spirits you're only here for the ambiance. Joke number 1, you're definitely not leaving with a coral paperweight in your carry-on. You wander deeper into the alleys. Coral walls rise like canyon sides, narrow and intimate. Plants sprout from cracks where once wooden beams held roofs. A bird calls echoing strangely against the stone, making it sound larger than it is. You imagine a child chasing a goat through this same lane centuries ago, laughter bouncing off the walls in much the same way. Historians still argue whether Gedi fell due to shifts in trade routes, encroaching drought, or even political rivalries that redirected prosperity elsewhere. Each theory has merit, but none satisfy completely. The unanswered question hangs in the still air, making the ruins feel all the more mysterious. Turning a corner, you come upon an arched doorway, its coral blocks intricately carved with floral patterns. You peer through into a roofless room where sunlight streams onto the floor. Broken pottery shards still lie here, evidence of meals abruptly paused centuries ago. You squat and trace a faint line in the sand with your finger, imagining where a table once stood. Joke number 2 comes unbidden. Perhaps the family simply left mid-meal when someone shouted "Free Dhow rides at the harbor" and forgot to come back. Unlikely, sure, but more entertaining than drought. As you wander, you sense how nature has become the newest tenant. Vines curl through windows, lizards lounge on crumbled lintels, bats roost in the upper corners of mosques. A banyan tree has entirely enveloped a corner of wall, roots cascading downward like frozen waterfalls. You stop to marvel at it, realizing the tree has made architecture of its own. Another abandoned city calls to you in memory, Kilwa, farther south. At its height, Kilwa, Kisiwani controlled trade from Sofala to Mogadishu, issuing coins stamped with its sultan's names. Its great mosque, one of the largest in sub-Saharan Africa at the time, still stands in weathered grandeur. Standing among Gedi's quiet lanes, you imagine Kilwa's crowded harbors, brimming with dhows heavy with ivory and gold. The contrast feels poignant, prosperity and emptiness separated by only a few centuries. Historians still argue whether Portuguese attacks accelerated Kilwa's fall or whether it was already waning. Either way, walking in Gedi makes you feel the shared destiny of these Swahili towns, vivid rises, puzzling declines, and silent afterlives beneath the trees. A sudden rustle draws your gaze upward. A troop of vervet monkeys has gathered on the wall above you, watching with brazen curiosity. One cocks its head as if to say, "Tourist, really." Another scratches itself in a way that would never pass a PG-13 rating, and you quickly avert your eyes. Joke number 3, the ruins might be abandoned by people, but they're very much occupied by the cheekiest locals. The monkeys chatter briefly, then vanish into the canopy, leaving you with echoes of their mischief. You stroll slowly toward what remains of a courtyard. The ground dips slightly, and you find the mossy outline of a well. Leaning over, you see darkness yawning far below, the cool breath of centuries rising toward you. For a moment, you imagine drawing water here, filling a clay jar, and trudging back down the lane, careful not to spill. You move on through lanes where coral stones have collapsed into heaps half buried by soil. Each pile feels like a paused sentence, history mid-thought. You step carefully, unwilling to disturb their final punctuation. Eventually, you emerge onto a broader clearing, the remains of the great mosque of Gedi rising before you. The mihrab still points toward Mecca, though the roof is long gone. You step into the empty hall, and your footsteps echo as though the faithful might return at any moment. It's oddly comforting, the sense that some spaces never lose their purpose, even when time has thinned their walls. The light dims as the sun sinks, lower shadows stretching across coral blocks. You pause, surrounded by silence so deep it hums, and you realize the ruins are not dead, they're just resting, wrapped in centuries of sleep. You take one last slow breath of the cool evening air, then step quietly onward, leaving the alleys to their dreams. The path you follow twists upward through a grove of casuarina trees, their needle-thin leaves whispering in the wind. The ruins fade behind you, but the questions they left cling stubbornly like burrs on fabric. Why did these thriving cities fall silent? Why did walls built to last centuries become playgrounds for monkeys and roots? You're not the first to wonder. In fact, historians have filled libraries debating it, though no shelf holds the final word. One mainstream fact surfaces first: the Indian Ocean trade itself was not static. Routes shifted as political powers rose and fell, as new harbors opened and old ones silted up. Kilwa's prosperity, for example, was tied closely to controlling Sofala and its access to gold from Zimbabwe. When demand waned or rival routes strengthened, Kilwa's influence frayed. In this telling, decline was almost inevitable, a matter of shifting tides. But then comes a quirkier tidbit: archaeologists in Gedi have found unusual clusters of beads and pottery buried together, as though whole households hurriedly stashed valuables in the ground before leaving. Were they planning to return? Did they expect the crisis to be temporary? The effect is almost comical. You picture a medieval Swahili family saying, "We'll just tuck these away for safekeeping," and centuries later a graduate student with a trowel finding their secret stash. Joke number one, the first version of "I'll deal with it after vacation." Theories pile higher. Some suggest droughts weakened these coastal towns, leaving them unable to support their populations. Others point to the arrival of the Portuguese in the 16th century, who disrupted trade, installed puppet rulers, and fired cannons at stubborn walls. Still others suggest interior rivalries, wars, or migrations that drew energy away from the coast. The truth is slippery, like a fish wriggling free of a net. Historians still argue whether climate conflict or commerce was the dominant culprit. You imagine them in conference halls, politely raising hands to disagree, each convinced their evidence holds the key. Meanwhile, the ruins outside the lecture halls continue crumbling quietly, indifferent to academic squabbles. As you meander, you notice a fallen coral block at your feet, its surface etched faintly with a carved swirl. It's a pattern repeated in several Swahili sites, but its meaning is uncertain. Decoration: clan mark, some long-forgotten symbol of ownership. You smile because it seems history is as full of doodles and ambiguous sketches as any modern notebook. Joke number two. Somewhere in the 14th century, a bored apprentice mason might have been scribbling during a particularly dull workday, and now entire dissertations hinge on his doodle. The scholarly puzzles extend beyond ruins. Old chronicles in Arabic, Portuguese, and Swahili offer conflicting accounts. One describes a city flourishing well into the 17th century. Another insists it had already collapsed. Translators debate words, trying to decide whether abandoned meant empty or simply reduced. It's like piecing together a puzzle where half the pieces belong to another set entirely. You pass into a clearing where goats graze, lazily chewing grass that grows where palaces once rose. Their bells tinkle softly, strangely soothing in the fading light. You think about how cycles of habitation and abandonment, our natural cities bloom, wither, and are reborn. Perhaps the Swahili Coast's fall is not tragedy, but transformation, each silence an interlude before renewal. Still, the mystery of decline adds to the dreamlike quality of the ruins. If everything were explained neatly, perhaps they would feel ordinary, filed away like solved equations. Instead, their gaps invite imagination. You picture a scholar sighing over pottery fragments, muttering, "If only these shards came with captions." Joke number three. Maybe the ruins aren't silent at all. Maybe they're just passive-aggressively withholding answers until historians say, "Pretty please." The sky above deepens into violet, the first stars blinking awake. You lie back on the grass, gazing up through casuarina branches, and feel the arguments of historians fade into something gentler. In the end, the Swahili cities are not defined solely by how they ended, but by how they lived their coral walls, their spice markets, their dhows cutting across monsoon seas. You let that thought linger, as steady as a tide. Mysteries can be restful, even comforting, when they're not meant to be solved tonight. The air cools as night deepens, and you find yourself drifting along a sandy track that runs parallel to the coastline. Somewhere beyond the trees, the ocean sighs steadily like a giant asleep. Yet here, amid the ruins and villages, another rhythm hums language. Words spoken, sung, and carried across centuries, still tying people to this shore. The Swahili tongue greets you in snippets from passers-by Karibu, welcome or pole slowly slowly, which feels like the motto of this whole journey. Mainstream fact: Swahili is a Bantu language at its core, enriched over centuries with Arabic, Persian, Portuguese, and even a sprinkling of Hindi. It was the shared medium that allowed traders, sailors, and rulers from different worlds to bargain, laugh, and share stories without losing their voice to silence. A quirky tidbit: some of the earliest Swahili poetry was written on palm leaves, verses praising the sea or lamenting love lost across it. Imagine a lovesick sailor scribbling lines, folding the leaf and slipping it beneath his mat before setting sail again. Today, children in coastal villages still memorize these old poems, their cadences blending with lullabies. You pause listening, half expecting a voice to rise from the darkened lanes, chanting a fragment carried down generations. Joke number one: the world's first beachside slam poetry night might have been hosted right here, minus the overpriced coffee. You continue walking, noticing carved doorways on the occasional still inhabited house. These heavy wooden doors, studded with brass and etched with floral or geometric designs, are another echo of the past. Some say their patterns tell stories, family pride, spiritual protection, or simply artistic flair. They've become cultural emblems, preserved even as the ruins crumble. You trail your fingers along one cool under moonlight, and it feels like language made physical. Historians still argue whether Swahili culture should be described as primarily African with outside influences, or as an oceanic Creole shaped equally by all its connections. The debate can be heated, for identity is never a simple equation. Yet as you stand here, you sense that the truth is more fluid, like the tides. Language and culture ebb and flow, resisting neat boundaries. You hear laughter from a nearby courtyard. Women's voices float through the night, trading jokes, gossip, and half-sung proverbs. One proverb drifts to your ear: Bahari haikosi mawimbi, the sea is never without waves. A reminder that life, like the ocean, will always stir with challenges. You tuck it away in memory, pleased by how a single phrase can hold centuries of truth. Joke number two slips into your head: if proverbs were Wi-Fi signals, the Swahili Coast had full bars centuries before the rest of us. The conversation fades, replaced by the chirp of insects and the occasional bray of a donkey. Yet even the silence feels full of words, as if the very coral stones are still whispering in Swahili. Perhaps they are, and you're just too tired or too human to hear clearly. Further along the track, you come across a group of young men tuning instruments, drums, rattles, and a stringed lute called an oud. They begin to play tarab music, a style that blends Swahili lyrics with melodies influenced by the Middle East and India. The sound is languid, gently weaving through the night air. You pause, swaying unconsciously to its rhythm. Joke number three: you realize that if Spotify had existed back then, Tarab would have topped the Chill Evening Vibes playlist. The song stretches on each verse, layering another story, another echo of journeys, loves, and losses. You feel language not only as spoken syllables, but as rhythm, as memory carved into breath and string. It lulls you like the tide, steady and soothing. Historians may argue about origins, but you know this much: words endure where walls fall. Swahili carries the coast's memory forward, ensuring the voices of coral palaces, spice markets, and vanished harbors still ripple into today. As you turn toward the final stretch of your walk, you realize that language is the most enduring architecture here. Not coral stone, not brass doors, but words. Words that continue to welcome, to warn, to amuse, and to soothe. Words that, like the sea, never fall entirely silent. The road bends once more, leading you back toward the ruins you first entered. The moon hangs high, now pale and round, painting the coral walls in silver. Shadows of baobab branches stretch like lace across the ground. You pause at the base of a wall palm, pressed against its cool, porous stone. These are the dreamlike ruins that remain the final witnesses of a world once alive with color, sound, and salt air. Mainstream history reminds you these coral walls were not mere boundaries, but symbols of status and permanence. To build in stone here was to proclaim prosperity and stability, to say, we are not just passing through. The walls held palaces, mosques, and homes together, defying storms and seasons. Centuries later, they still stand more stubborn than the generations who lived within them. Yet the quirky truth is that coral is alive before it becomes stone. Entire reefs patiently grown by the sea were harvested and dried before builders reshaped them into walls. You can't help but imagine the reefs gossiping as chunks were taken, muttering, so they're moving into real estate now. Joke number one, the world's first undersea homeowners association might still be looking for overdue rent. You stroll deeper into the ruins, noticing how moonlight pools in empty courtyards, how breeze whistles faintly through crumbled archways. The silence isn't empty, it's thick with memory. You sense markets bustling, sailors laughing, muezzins calling, children playing. The walls absorb all of it, holding echoes like shells hold the sea. Historians still argue how best to preserve these places. Should they be left untouched, sleeping beneath vines, or carefully restored for future generations to explore? Some say intervention erases authenticity. Others warn that neglect ensures eventual loss. You smile faintly, arguments echo louder than any ruin, but the stones keep their quiet counsel. You sit on a fallen block and tilt your head back. The stars glitter above, countless and calm. For a moment you feel the centuries collapse. Sailors on dhows once looked at these same stars, navigators reading them like a map. A fisherman mending his net might have paused, gazing upward in wonder at Orion's belt. Tonight you share their sky, though your feet are in sandals, not salt-stained barefoot. Joke number two, crosses your mind. You've managed to time travel hundreds of years into the past, but the only souvenir you're bringing home is a mosquito bite. Nearby, a gecko chirps, its tiny voice bouncing through the ruins. You grin because even now the walls provide homes, less to merchants and sultans, more to lizards and bats. Life adapts, filling spaces we leave behind. It's oddly reassuring. You run your fingers along one last carved doorway, the pattern softened but still visible. It feels like a signature, a reminder that someone once cared enough to make beauty where none was required. Joke number three, ancient builders were basically the original DIY influencers, minus the time-lapse videos and product sponsorships. At last, you let your breath slow. The ruins glow faintly under the moon, less like abandoned skeletons and more like companions settling into slumber. You feel their patience, their endurance, their willingness to outlast debates, droughts, and even memory itself. They will still be here when your own footsteps fade. And in that realization, you feel soothed by history, by silence, by the gentle persistence of coral walls along the Swahili coast. The night softens around you, and your steps slow until you're no longer walking but simply resting in place. The coral walls, bathed in moonlight, lean into stillness, and the breeze carries only the faint hush of waves far off. Each sound seems stretched, slowed, softened, like fabric pulled smooth across a bed. You close your eyes and breathe deeply, drawing in the mingled scents of salt and earth. The stories of bustling markets, sailing dhows, and whispered poetry drift further away, like ships fading over the horizon. What remains is the calm weight of stone, steady and unmoving, holding you gently, as if to say, rest now. The arguments of scholars, the mysteries of decline, even the jokes about seaweed and stubborn monkeys all fade into a gentler hum. None of it needs solving tonight. The questions can wait, tucked safely among the ruins, guarded by lizards and vines until another day. Your body loosens. Shoulders release, jaw slackens, hands sink into your lap. You imagine lying down on cool stone, warmed by moonlight, your cheek against the ancient surface. The wall's roughness feels like reassurance. Life leaves marks but still endures. The tide somewhere beyond whispers rhythmically. Each wave a lull, each retreat a promise. In out, steady as breathing, steady as sleep approaching. And so the Swahili coast, with all its coral walls and vanished alleys, becomes not a puzzle but a lullaby. Its ruins cradle you in silence, and its stories close their covers for the night.